The Drive with Chris Barth on 702 ABC Sydney.
Well, appropriate, we should be talking about Brisbane because our next guest is joining us from Brisbane. We're going to talk about the celebration of 100 years since the birth of the man who wrote this.
Real witches dress in ordinary clothes and look very much like ordinary women. They live in ordinary houses and they work in ordinary jobs. That is why they are so hard to catch. A real witch hates children with a red-hot, sizzling hatred that is more sizzling and red-hot than any hatred you could possibly imagine.
Oh, that's the sizzling red-hot The Witches, written by, of course, Roald Dahl. I loved his books growing up. I still do, the fun and the whimsy of them, his beautiful use of language and optimistic. James Bang, Fantastic Mr. Fox, among many, many others. And what you may not know is he also film You Only Live Twice. His foray into adult fiction wasn't great. He liked writing for kids a lot more, but I really think his children's fiction was for adults too. He was dishing up inspirational quotes long before they were a thing, and joining us to celebrate Roald Dahl today from Brisbane is children's author and former teacher Jacqueline Harvey. Jacqueline, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks very much, Chris.
How would you describe Roald Dahl as an author?
Oh, I think he's absolutely brilliant. He's certainly one of the best that has ever lived. And I think his stories, the subversive characters in the stories that often there's some really grim, dreadful people, like the Trunchbull in Matilda, that children they really have to battle and overcome quite dark things at times. So, and there's also so much fun in them as well. I just think, his books are spectacular.
Yeah, this is one of my favourites. This is from Horrible Rhymes, Three Little Pigs. Have a listen to this.
Little pig, let me come in.
No, by the hairs on my chin.
Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in. The little pig began to pray, but Wolfie blew his house away. He shouted, bacon, pork, and ham. Oh, what a lucky wolf I am.
In Revolting Rhymes, I loved all the twists and turns that he made with those, traditional children's rhymes and turned them into fantastic pieces of poetry.
He certainly did, and in fact, one of my sort of party tricks, if you like, when I was doing a while, and I learned the Anteater, which was in the Revolting Rhymes book, off by heart, and could read the whole thing to a class, and it sort of had them eating out of the palm of your hand. And I sort of knew I'd won them over as soon as I got through the Anteater with all those sort of voices and accents and things. They loved it.
Also, he did a bit of a take on Cinderella, and when I used to read it to my son, there was a bit of a controversial word in there.
There is. There's a few controversial things. I think then the pistol whips the pistol from her knickers in the Little Red Riding Hood. I think he loved that sort of element of naughtiness and fun, and I think that children really appreciate that and absolutely love that, slightly subversive things that he would do.
Yeah, almost fractured fairy tales, weren't they?
Absolutely.
I remember I'd always get to the bit in Cinderella and think, oh, substitution word, what rhymes with that?
Yes, I think I used to use the word mutt quite a lot.
I was just about to say, that's what I use, mutt.
Yes.
For those of you wondering what on earth we're talking about, it's a word that starts with S and ends with T that I can't say on the radio, but it's a way that he was describing a person in that fractured fairy tale. But
yes,
in context, it's quite funny.
Yeah, it is, but it was quite shocking. I remember when I first read it, I sort of looked twice and thought, oh, I can't say that to the kids. So.
Now, I loved Willy Wonka and James and the Giant Peach. Do you have a favourite book?
I have two favourites. I think the Twits is certainly one of my favourite. Mr. and Mrs. Twit were just so vile and such horrible human beings. And I think that's a really interesting book because it's one of the only children's books where there are actually no children in the story until the very, very end when the little boys lose their pants because they get glued to the top of the big tree. And, the only thing you actually hear about children is these little boys running away with their naked bottoms blinking in the sun. And I think, Mr. and Mrs. Twit were just revolting, and the sorts of things that they did to each other, like when Mrs. Twit substituted the spaghetti with worms and made her husband eat the worms, and then when he started making her feel like she had the shrinks, and so he kept on adding little tiny sort of coin-sized pieces to her walking stick, so she thought she was getting smaller and smaller all the time. So that's definitely a huge favourite of mine. And the other is Matilda. And I couldn't tell you the number of times that I've read these books aloud to classes. It would be numerous, tens of times.
We've got a bit from George's medicine here. Have a listen to this.
He pushed the spoon well into her mouth and tipped the mixture down her throat. Then he stepped back to watch the result. It was worth watching. Grandma yelled, "Ah!" and her whole body shot up, whoosh, into the air. Up she went like a jack-in-the-box, and she didn't come down. She stayed there, suspended in mid-air, about 2 feet up.
How many times have we all been there?
Absolutely.
I've got a text in. Ian from Balmain says, My Uncle Oswald, one of the funniest adult books ever. I don't know that I've read that one, My Uncle Oswald.
No, actually, that's not one that I'm familiar with.
And there's BFG as well. Let's have a listen to this.
Sophie allowed her eye to travel further and further down the street. Suddenly she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. It was something black, something tall and black, something very tall and very black and very thin.
And also on the text line I've got in, Ian Fleming wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, going solo as a Dahl biography, telling how he was a pilot war hero.
Yeah, so actually there was something really interesting in the paper about that the other day, and that saying that, in fact, he credited crashing his plane in Libya with starting his career as a children's author, because he said he got a very nasty bump on the head, and it sort of turned his life in a different direction. And I also had sort of thought that he was a war hero, and that he'd seen some active service in being shot down over Libya. But I did read the other day that perhaps isn't quite right, and that he actually got lost and crashed the plane. And this piece that I was reading about him said he never let the truth get in the way of a really good story.
Well, thank goodness he didn't, because we would have missed out on all those good
Absolutely.
But things like James and the Giant Peach and Willy Wonka, you wonder where he came up with all of that.
Look, I mean, a lot of his stories are credited with, twists on things that actually happened in his life. So he wrote over 600 letters to his mother during her lifetime, and many of the letters that he wrote during his time at boarding school, and then when he was a young man living in Africa. And during his time where he was, allegedly he perhaps was even a spy working in Washington.
Yes, do we know whether that was true?
Oh, I think that one is probably true. I think that's probably it seems like there's a bit of evidence that could have been the case. And I think a lot of the things that he wrote for kids then, he turned, like his headmaster at the school St. Peter's in Somerset was an absolute tyrant. And they say that, he had this glistening gold-rimmed tooth, and his hair was so shiny. He used so much sort of brill cream in his hair that you could almost see a reflection in it. And I think he used a female version of that headmaster as the Trunchbull in Matilda. So he's obviously used a lot of his own life, but given it that extra, as us children's authors tend to do, give lots of extra bits and pieces to it to make it over the top and more interesting to kids.
And is it true that his first book, The Gremlins, was a bit of a flop?
I don't know, actually. That's not one I'm familiar with at all.
It was 1943, I think he published it. I was reading about it, and they said it was a bit of a flop. But then I think it's the book that Disney might have made the movie out of all those years later.
Oh, well, there you go. It's it certainly went from being a flop to a hit, that's for sure.
Yeah, and Fantastic Mr. Fox is always a huge hit with kids too.
It's fabulous. In fact, just last weekend, or weekend before last, there was a group of us children's authors who put on a public reading of Fantastic Mr. Fox in Federation Square as part of the Melbourne Writers' Festival, and we were able to get a dad up on stage to play one of the parts of the hideous farmers, Boggis and Bunce and Bean, and we got a group of four children who were in the audience came up and were my little foxes, because I played the part of Mrs. Fox, and I have to say it was one of the most fantastic, great, fun things I've done in a very long time.
I've managed to find out a bit about my Uncle Oswald while we've been chatting. Apparently it was a short story from the diary of his fictional Uncle Oswald, a rich gentleman whose sexual exploits from the subject of these stories are basically what it's about. And in My Uncle Oswald, the uncle engages a temptress to seduce 20th century geniuses and royalty with a love potion secretly added to chocolate truffles made by Dahl's favourite chocolate shop, Prestat of Piccadilly, London.
Oh, I think he had some really subversive things going on.
I'll have to go and borrow that now.
Definitely.
Why do you think his literature is so timeless?
I think that, he writes, he appeals to children. You think about the themes that he writes about, and, he's got family and food, and he's got lots of, the really nasty characters, so baddies that you have to overcome. And the kids are always really central, apart from obviously in the twits, but the kids are the, central characters who need to overcome a whole lot of obstacles. And so I think, it is that timeless, there are timeless themes, and kids just really relate to, I guess, the naughtiness too and the fun factor.
Yeah, well, I think it's the way that he uses language too. It's so vivid.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, he's had such a huge influence on so many of the writers today as well, who, he's kind of our yardstick. He's the one that we all look up to and say, the writing is just so brilliant and the characters are so clear. And I think that's really a great part of what he did.
Just a bit of a warning on Uncle Oswald on the text line in from John. Uncle Oswald is pretty funny, but very crude / explicit. Don't let the kids anywhere near it.
Yeah, I'd say definitely not for kids.
And also I've been pulled up on the text. We're missing some of the best Roald Dahl adult books. Over to you, Someone Like You, and of course Kiss Kiss.
Yeah, there's the Wonderful World of Henry Sugar, I think, is another one that he did. But I must say, having been a teacher, I am much more familiar with his works for children and his own biography, Boy and Going Solo, than I was with any of his adult works.
And as a writer, do you envy how prolific he was?
No, I admire him. I think he was an amazing writer. He had fabulous output, and he didn't start, he really didn't start his children's book writing career until he was in his 40s, and I think it's a great model for all of us who aspire to be writers, that you don't have to start when you're 20. You can, grow into it if you like. I think for me personally, one of the greatest influences he's had on my career is that because I read so many of his books out loud to children, I really got a feel for what made a great read-aloud story. And when I write my own books, I write them out loud, if you like. So I'll write a chapter, then read it out loud. And one of the things I was reading about him not so long ago was that he used to read all of his stories to his wife Felicity, in bed at night. And I have to say that my husband suffers a very similar fate to that, as he can't read them. I can't read them to him while we're in bed because I think he'll go to sleep. But I do sort of strap him in the chair almost in the study some days and say, look, I need you to listen to Alice Miranda's latest adventure, or it's and it really works. And I think kids know what works as a read aloud, and parents love that there's, with Roald Dahl, there was always something in it for the parents, and that's certainly something that I try and do in my own work, which, he's such a fabulous role model. I just wish that I had met him.
Oh, don't we all? Jacqueline,
absolutely.
Pleasure chatting to you about Roald Dahl. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks a lot. Bye.
That's Jacqueline Harvey, a children's author and former teacher, celebrating 100 years since Roald Dahl's birth with us here on Drive. 28 minutes past 4.